The best of money matters. The big story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Honbin Jeong. A man made headlines after he was shot in the lower back while cycling with friends in a restricted area between Upper Seletar and Upper Peirce reservoirs on June 15th. Now, the incident occurred about 2.3 kilometers from a Nee Soon military range where a live firing exercise was underway. The police said that the man's injury is not life-threatening and he is currently in a stable condition after surgery to remove the bullet. A statement from MINDEF on June 16th indicates that the Military Manoeuvres Act prohibits unauthorized entry into gazetted SAF live firing areas for safety. So what are the gazetted areas in Singapore? How much trouble would you get into if you find yourself trespassing? And what are the legal consequences that you might face? Well, joining us today to share more is Ng Kai Ling, who's Associate Director at LIMN Law Corporation. Hi, Kai Ling. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Honbin.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Kai Ling, a man was cycling with friends earlier this week in the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, specifically in a restricted zone between the Upper Seletar and Upper Peirce reservoirs. Now, despite the area being clearly marked and gazetted for live firing by the SAF, he entered the zone and was struck in the lower back by a bullet. How big of an offense is this? Can a person who enters a gazetted military zone face criminal charges even if they were unaware?
Well, how big of an offense really depends on what you did within the military area. For example, if you interfere with the execution of the military maneuver, then you could be charged with an offense under the Military Manoeuvres Act. And if convicted, you could be facing a fine of up to $2,000, a jail term of up to 6 months, or both. But let's say you enter the area, you quickly leave without causing any damage or perhaps only nominal damage, you could still be charged for willful trespass under the Miscellaneous Offences, Public Order and Nuisance Act. But in this case, if you are convicted, you are facing a fine of up to $1,000. There is no jail term involved.
Okay. So just for some background context here, how are gazetted areas similar to or different from protected areas or places?
But the distinction is not so much whether it's gazetted or not, because a place could be gazetted for purposes such as tree conservation, preserving the appearance of an area. You have acts such as the Planning Act, the Parks and Tree Acts, and so forth. So the difference is really in terms of the purpose for which you are trying to restrict or control access, entry, or the activities being conducted within the area. So if the purpose is to carry out military maneuvers, live firing exercises, then MINDEF has the authority to declare the area as a military area under the Military Manoeuvres Act. But for example, if you are talking about sensitive locations or infrastructures, then for example, if you have military installations, you have water reservoirs, key infrastructure sites, basically things that are important to national security, public safety, or essential services, then these locations could be declared as protected areas or protected places under the Infrastructure Protection Act. So in terms of the difference between a protected area and a protected place, members of the public can still access a protected area, but they can expect measures controlling their movement or their activities within that area. But when you're talking about a protected place, then you're talking about a specific building or structure. And for these places, access is usually off limits unless you are authorized.
Okay. So, is this the first particular case that has ever happened? When was the last time someone was charged under the MMA or the IPA?
In terms of the MMA, there are no reported prosecutions. But under the IPA, this is actually prior to the enactment of the IPA, there was another act called the Protected Areas and Protected Places Act. Now, this act has been repealed and partially incorporated under the IPA. But under that act, there were a number of prosecutions. So one of the notable ones would be the case in 2010 where a Swiss national by the name of Oliver Fricker and his accomplice, they were sentenced 2 months in prison for violating the act because they broke into SMRT's Changi depot.
Okay. Well, Kai Ling, what constitutes then as an unlawful entry into a gazetted military training area? And does intent matter in such cases?
I think the simple answer to this question is unless you are specifically involved in a military exercise, you just shouldn't be in that area.
Yeah.
But of course, in terms of the intention, there is a distinction. So we often hear of people saying that, oh, but I didn't intend to break the law. In this case, in this particular instance, when we're talking about intention, we're not talking so much about the intention of breaking the law, but we're talking about the intention to enter into that area.
Right.
So long as you wanted to go into the area, doesn't matter whether you knew or you didn't know that you were breaking the law.
I see. What are some examples of other gazetted areas in Singapore? I mean, how many gazetted areas are there around the country that we might know about?
But there's no official consolidation to my knowledge in terms of all the gazetted areas in Singapore. But gazetted areas can be more common than we think because tree conservation areas, for example, if there's a specific tree that is very old and you want to protect that tree, those can be gazetted as well under the Parks and Trees Act. But we're talking about military areas, then we will have examples such as the Jurong Troop Maneuvering Ground, the Changi Troop Maneuvering Ground, and firing grounds that will include those at Pulau Tekong, Mandai Camp 4, Nee Soon Ranges, so and so forth. So that they could be more common than we actually think.
Okay. Now, the police also mentioned that the man's injury is not life-threatening and he is currently in a stable condition after surgery to remove the bullet. Now, Kai Ling, if someone is accidentally injured by military activity while trespassing in a restricted area, does the SAF or government bear any legal liability?
But when we talk about liability for personal injury, the first questions we always ask is, does the SAF or the government owe any duty to take care of the safety of trespassers? And secondly, have they failed to take reasonable safety measures? On the second part, we are talking about reasonable measures and not all possible measures because the courts recognize that you don't have to take every single possible safety measures. You just need to do what is reasonable. So in this case, if, for example, signs have already been put up warning that there'll be live firing exercises being carried out, notices have been published on MINDEF's website to inform you of the dates of these exercises, it can be quite difficult to argue that SAF or the government should have done more to maybe prevent you from entering the military area or do more to ensure your safety while you were there without authorization.
Well, speaking of which, apparently multiple cyclists have said that they had ridden the trail for years and even encountered soldiers, with some even cycling away when the authorities spotted them on the trail. At the same time, there are no known prosecutions under the Military Manoeuvres Act. So since many cyclists are actually aware that it is illegal to, use this trail, should harsher penalties be implemented to avoid a similar incident from happening again?
Well, it's possible to have harsher penalties. That is one area where it could possibly act as a bigger deterrent. But I think one difficulty that we always have is in enforcement because it's just not possible to, for example, install cameras everywhere or have manpower stationed to cover every inch of the restricted area. It's just not an efficient or good use of resources. I think at the end of the day, the public should also recognize that sometimes it's for their own good that they are being kept out of certain areas. And it also boils down to individual responsibility.
Right. Now, MParks has confirmed that visitors must remain on designated trails and are subject to enforcement action if they go off trail. Now, the trails are marked with signs, maps, and even directional indicators. Are MParks' current signs and trail markers sufficient to deter illegal off-trail activity in areas that overlap with SAF training zones?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, there were actually many cyclists who are aware that it's illegal to use this particular trail that we are concerned with in this incident that happened recently. So in terms of whether the current signs and markers are sufficient, that seems to be the case. But as mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, there's only so much the government can do. If they put up signs but we don't pay attention to those signs or we don't check for the signs or don't look out for the signs, then really what more can the government do on their end? So it also boils down to individual responsibility to check online whether the place we're entering is restricted or not, to look out for the signs, just be aware of where you are at, of your surroundings.
Okay. Well, then, do you think NParks should take a more proactive role than the SAF in monitoring and enforcing public access in these shared spaces? What are some efficient approaches that they can come up with?
Well, I suspect in terms of the allocation of resources, MParks may not have as much resources, or at the very least, their focus is more on conservation. rather than ensuring that people do not enter restricted or protected zones. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there is only so much that can be done, and it wouldn't be an efficient use of resources to, let's say, station certain manpower over at certain checkpoints to make sure that people do not accidentally enter the area or do not enter the area. I think the reasonable measures that can be done is to put up signages, and that has already been done. So ultimately, I would say that it also boils down to individual responsibility, and I cannot stress that enough. So because it is your personal safety that is also at stake, as demonstrated by this case. So I would say that pending any further measures taken by the government on the individual level, it is always open to you to look out for the signs and just to be aware of your surroundings.
All right. Well, speaking of which, it is an individual responsibility. So, I mean, this is a one-off case, but how can the public better safeguard themselves in the near future?
Well, there's a very good resource, which is MINDEF's website, where they actually publish advisories to advise the public of when they'll be carrying out the exercises and where those exercises will be conducted. In fact, the latest notice published was on 19th of June, so just today. And they have advised that live firing exercises will be carried out at the Pasir Laba live firing area from Monday 23rd June to Monday 30th of June. So if any listeners will be in the area, I would advise them to take proper care and look out for where they are at.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kai Ling, for your time and your insights today.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you. That was Ng Kai Ling, who's Associate Director at LIMN Law Corporation. This has been The Big Story with me, Honbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.